Welcome to the 7th Annual Celebration of Chicago History, sponsored by Friends of Historic Second Church. I am Linda Miller, and I'm the president of Friends. We are a secular, not-for-profit organization separate from the church, with a mission to preserve and restore the art and architecture of Chicago's landmark Second Presbyterian Church, and to engage neighbors and the world in sharing our passion for its beauty and significance. One of the ways we engage our neighbors in our work is through this annual celebration of history. We sponsor lectures and walking tours throughout the year, and we hope you will join us in future programs. We also, as you've seen tonight, have 35 trained docents who provide tours throughout the year on Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, and on prearranged tours. We'd be happy to schedule a tour for your group. And of course, we are engaged in raising the money for the preservation of this beautiful 1901 interior. If you've taken a tour this evening, you will have seen some of what we've already accomplished and caught a glimpse of what remains to be done. Tonight's celebration is co-sponsored by the Chicago Art Deco Society. Anna Marie, is that the president of the organization? And I know many of you are members of the Chicago Art Deco. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you join us on this really fun evening. I would also particularly like to acknowledge Wintrust for underwriting this event. Laura Mishlove, are you here? Oh, there she is. Thank you so much. Laura is a senior vice president, and she's joined us tonight. I think it's particularly fitting that we celebrate Chicago history in this church. The congregation has been in existence for 177 years, almost since the beginning of Chicago's history, and has lived through the ups and downs and the many major events of our proud city. Each year we focus on one aspect of Chicago's history. Tonight will be particularly fun because the topic is Chicago in the Roaring Twenties, the thoroughly modern metropolis. To lead us through this era, our speaker is Kathleen Skolnik. Kathleen teaches art and architecture history at Roosevelt University and leads seminars in Art Deco design at the Newberry Library. Her next seminar, America, Art Deco Design and Designers, will begin in September. She's the author of the Art Deco murals of Hildreth Maher, a noted 20th century American muralist, and the editor of the English translation of Havana Art Deco, an architectural guide, and has written and lectured extensively on Art Deco. Please join me in welcoming Kathleen.
Thank you, Linda, and thanks to the Friends of Historic Second Church for inviting me to speak tonight about Chicago in the Roaring Twenties. I've subtitled this presentation, The Thoroughly Modern Metropolis, because it was in the 1920s that Chicago really began to move into the modern age. World War I was over, and the city and its people were looking to the future. And many of Chicago's iconic buildings and important civic improvements and significant events in the fields of culture and sports and entertainment can be traced to the 1920s. I want to begin on May 14th, 1920. It was a momentous day in Chicago, a cause for great celebration. Anybody know what happened on that? Yes? They opened the Michigan Avenue Bridge. You know your Chicago history. And judging from this photo, just about the entire city came out to watch. At 4 p.m. on Friday, May 14th, Mayor William Hale, oh my goodness, what happened here? Why am I forgetting his name? William Hale Thompson, known as Big Bill Thompson. How could I forget that? William Hale Thompson cut the ribbon officially opening the Michigan Avenue Bridge, and the mayor's car was the first one to drive across it. This photo shows the ribbon cutting ceremony, and the man on the far left, standing next to the mayor, is Charles Wacker, who was the chairman of the Chicago Plan Commission. An article in the Chicago Tribune that day carried the headline, "I Will, Spirit Wins," and it identified the bridge as the greatest single improvement in Chicago's history. This is a cartoon that appeared in the Tribune that day, and it shows the celebration going on up at the bridge, and in the foreground, there's a man fishing. It's by John McCutcheon, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist, and he worked for the Tribune for about 40 years. The cartoon reads, "They would have thought him crazy if old John Kinsey, fishing in the river at Rush Street 100 years ago, had said, 'Yes, sir, I predict that in about 100 years, there will be the third largest city in the whole world right here. And there'll be a bridge over this here river that will open like a knife, and that 50,000 newfangled things called automobiles will cross that bridge every day, and that boats run by the stuff that comes out of a tea kettle when it's boiling will dash up and down the river, and that flying machines will fly every which way, and that property round here will be worth over $100 an acre.'" The opening day ceremonies almost ended in tragedy. After the ribbon cutting, there was a steady flow of traffic across the bridge, and bands were playing, and there were fireworks displays. While all this was going on, a steamer loaded with lumber pulled up to the bridge and signaled for it to open. The bridge tender started raising the south span, not realizing there were 4 automobiles on it. The cars slid backward, and they would have fallen through the opening and into the river if the Chicago police had not fired their guns to get the attention of the bridge tender. This new bridge would greatly transform Upper Michigan Avenue, which had previously been known as Pine Street. Prior to the construction of the Michigan Avenue Bridge, Michigan Avenue was only on the south side of the river. But that transformation would take a little time. As you can see in this aerial photo, which was taken in the early phase after the construction of the bridge, the only major structure in the area at the time was the Wrigley Building. In 1918, William Wrigley Jr. had purchased land on what would become the northwest corner of the Michigan Avenue Bridge Plaza, and he commissioned the Chicago firm of Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White to design a new headquarters for his chewing gum company. He asked the architects for an appealing structure that would attract shoppers and businesses to the area, a building that would make an architectural statement when it was viewed from the south side of the river, and a design that would project an appropriate corporate image for his company. The principal designer, Charles Biersman, responded with this Spanish Renaissance Revival style building, with the tower modeled after the Giralda Tower on the 16th century Seville Cathedral. When the building opened in 1921, that tower was strictly decorative. A 1920 zoning ordinance in Chicago had limited building height to 260 feet. Taller towers were allowed, but they couldn't be occupied. The main block of the Wrigley Building was 240 feet high, which fell within the height limit, but the tower rose to almost 400 feet, which clearly exceeded it, so the tower was left empty. The walls of the Wrigley Building above the river level were clad in terracotta tiles that lightened in color as the building rose. They were cream-colored at the base, they were a brilliant white at the top. The entrance was positioned at a diagonal to Michigan Avenue to make the building clearly visible from the south side of the river, as William Wrigley had requested. The Wrigley Building was so successful that William Wrigley commissioned an addition to the north, designed by the same firm in the same architectural style, and completed in 1924. It was separated from the original building by a ground level plaza, and the two were joined by a passageway at the third floor. In the 1930s, a second connection would be constructed, a sky bridge at the 14th level. You may think that those water taxis that we have on the river today are a new concept. But back in 1922, a water jitney or river jitney was operating between the Wrigley Building dock and the Northwestern and Union stations. The trip took about 10 minutes. The boat carried 80 passengers, and it cost 15 cents, or 10 cents if you bought a book of 10 rides. The second major building on the Michigan Avenue Bridge Plaza was the London Guarantee and Accident Company building, here in this aerial photo. It was on the southwest corner of the Bridge Plaza, across the river from the Wrigley Building. The developers didn't want their building to be overshadowed by the Wrigley Building. So their architect, Alfred Ahlschlager, gave them what has been described as one of the finest examples of the Beaux-Arts style in Chicago, with a grand curved entrance modeled after a Roman triumphal arch, and a domed pavilion or tempietto, a little temple up at the top. In 1919, Colonel Robert McCormick, who was the owner and publisher of the Chicago Tribune, purchased land on the northeast side of the bridge, which was under construction at the time. And the following year, a new 6-story printing plant for the Tribune opened on the site. You can see it in the lower right-hand corner in this aerial photo. And here's a closer look at it. In 1922, McCormick announced that the Tribune would be moving its editorial and administrative offices to this site into a new building with a design that would be determined by an international architectural competition. During the months of the competition, images of famous buildings from throughout the world, dating from antiquity up to the 20th century, appeared in the Tribune Sunday supplement, along with headlines that posed questions like, "What about these?" and "Ancient or modern?" And the Tribune readers were invited to submit their comments about the building design to the paper's architectural editor. Some of the buildings that were featured included the ancient Roman Pantheon, St. Peter's Basilica, and the Woolworth Building in New York, shown on the right, which appeared twice. McCormick seemed to be partial to neo-Gothic. So it's not surprising that the winning entry was this Gothic revival design submitted by John Mead, Howells, and Raymond Hood of New York. The building features an octagonal tower covered with gargoyles and Gothic tracery, and it's crowned with a ring of flying buttresses like you find on Gothic cathedrals. Just 2 days before the winner in the competition was to be selected, the Tribune received this late entry from the Finnish architect Eliel Saarinen. The jurors were so impressed by it that they felt that it just had to be included along with the other finalists. It didn't win the competition, as you know, that Gothic revival design won, but it came in second, and it had an important influence on later architecture, which you can see in the design for the fourth building on the Michigan Avenue Bridge Plaza at the southeast corner, the one here on the left. A speculative office building that was just known by its address, 333 North Michigan Avenue. Unlike the other buildings surrounding the bridge, this one didn't have any historical references. At the time, it was described as modernistic or modern, and today we would call it Art Deco. The building consists of a long, narrow, 24-story block that extends along Michigan Avenue, and this is where the main entrance was, and an 11-story tower pushed to the north overlooking the Chicago River and the Michigan Avenue Bridge. Here's a comparison between the north facade of that building and the Saarinen entry in the Tribune competition, which is on the right. 333 is on the left. They both have these cascading setbacks and vertical bands of windows which emphasize the verticality of the designs. The tower rose to a height of 426 feet. I just said that the maximum allowable height was 260 feet. So did that mean that this tower was empty, just like the tower on the Wrigley Building? Well, no, it didn't, because in 1923, a new zoning ordinance was passed in Chicago. This one increased the maximum allowable height to 264 feet, which was only 4 feet higher than the previous limit. But more importantly, it allowed that maximum height to be exceeded if the building were set back from the lot line and it conformed to a mathematical formula related to area and volume. This ordinance allowed the towers of pre-existing buildings like the Wrigley Building to be occupied, and it accounted for that stepped back or setback configuration that is so typically associated with Art Deco architecture. A new Civic improvement enhanced the appeal of 333 North Michigan to potential tenants. In 1926, a double-decked roadway had been constructed along the south side of the river, which relieved traffic congestion in the area. And this photo shows that roadway under construction. At the time, it was known as the South Water Street Improvement Project. But by the time of the dedication, it had become known as, I'm sure you all know, Wacker Drive, named for the chairman of the Chicago Plan Commission. In their 1909 plan of Chicago, Daniel Burnham and Edward Bennett had envisioned Upper Michigan Avenue as a grand commercial boulevard that would be lined with neoclassical buildings with a uniform height of 10 stories. And this is the artist Jules Guerin's interpretation of that vision. But that's not what happened on Michigan Avenue. The diversity in styles that we just saw in the buildings that surrounded the Michigan Avenue Bridge continued in the buildings that were constructed on Upper Michigan Avenue in the 1920s. Buildings like Allerton House, later the Allerton Hotel, designed in a northern Italian Renaissance revival style. The Medinah Athletic Club, which is the Intercontinental Hotel today, with the setbacks. They're typical of Art Deco and decoration derived from the ancient Near East. The French-influenced Women's Athletic Club and the Art Deco McGraw-Hill building. The heights of the buildings also varied. But the Burnham and Bennett vision of the types of buildings that would be located on Michigan Avenue was fulfilled. Both they and the North Central Business District Association envisioned Michigan Avenue filled with office buildings, hotels, financial institutions, clubs, and upscale shops. They didn't want to see any saloons or pool halls or automobile dealerships. The members, I wonder about that Tesla, if that would have been acceptable. The members of the North Central Business District Association banded together and agreed not to rent to tenants whom they considered undesirable. And in this way, the Burnham and Bennett vision of Michigan Avenue as this prestigious commercial promenade was realized. This is one of the smaller buildings that was constructed on Upper Michigan Avenue in the 1920s. It's only 6 stories. But it's very much in keeping with the character of the street, both in terms of its style and its purpose. I don't have a historic photo of this building, but I think this drawing better represents the French-inspired Art Deco details than the later photographs that I was able to find. It was built for Jacques' woman's clothing store. Jacques Potts, whose real first name was Jacob, had opened a women's clothing boutique in 1906. During most of the 1920s, it was located at 612 South Michigan Avenue. But in early 1928, after a removal sale that, according to this ad that was in the Chicago Tribune, liquidated all of the merchandise that was at the South Michigan Avenue location, Jacques moved to 545 North Michigan Avenue. The store was on the first 5 levels, and Potts and his wife lived in a maisonette on the top floor. Relief sculptures on either side of the entrance, you can see them here and here, depicted stylized, elegantly dressed women who were a perfect advertisement for the merchandise that you would find inside the store. About 7 or 8 years ago, the Art Deco details on the ground floor of this building were covered with these nondescript cast concrete panels that don't seem to have made any effort to match the color of the original limestone cladding. Fortunately, the reliefs are still visible, and those panels are said to be attached with clips that would allow them to be removed without damaging the facade. So someday, I hope that a more sympathetic tenant or owner will return the building to its original appearance. I would certainly hope so, because these used to be one of my very favorite Art Deco buildings in Chicago. Jacques was not the only place where fashionable Chicago women could shop in the 1920s. There was, of course, Marshall Field's, whose customers could become familiar with the latest styles through Fashions of the Hour, a magazine that was published by Fields 6 times a year between 1914 and 1978. Here are the covers of 2 issues from the 1920s. The one on the left is from 1925. The one on the right is from 1928. Another option was Blum's. Blum's, like Jacques, had been established in the early 20th century. It opened in 1908, and during the 1920s, it was located in the Congress Hotel on South Michigan Avenue. In the 1930s, the name would change to Blum's Vogue, and the store would relocate to North Michigan Avenue. Martha Weathered opened an exclusive women's clothing store in the Drake Hotel in 1921, and it would remain in business until the early 1970s. Here are 3 dresses from the 1920s that were sold at Martha Weathered, and this silver lame and lace dress over on the far right is now in the collection of the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 1929, Saks opened its first branch store, and it was located here in Chicago at the southwest corner of Michigan and Chestnut, where the Verizon store is today. The image that you see in this ad for Saks that was in the Tribune is the work of the French artist Jean Dupas. And it was very prestigious to have Jean Dupas doing your advertising. In the 1930s, Saks would relocate a few blocks south to the east side of Michigan Avenue. Chicago women looking for stylish hats in the 1920s might visit the millinery shop of Charles Boucheron on State Street. Charles Boucheron sounds very French, but he wasn't French, he was from Chicago, and his real name was Charles James. When he opened his millinery shop in 1926, his father refused to allow him to use the family name, so he adopted Boucheron instead. It's hard to find early hats designed by Charles James, but here are 2 examples from 1928 that are in the collection of the Chicago History Museum. Charles James didn't stay in Chicago for too long after he opened his store. In 1928, he moved to New York, where he would eventually become known for his elegant, highly structured ball gowns that were coveted by New York socialites. Another Chicago milliner who got his start in the 1920s was Benjamin Greenfield. In 1920, he opened a store where his Bess Ben line of hats was sold. The name Bess Ben was a combination of his first name, Benjamin, and the first name of his sister, Bessie, who worked with him. And we have some Bess Ben hats here tonight. The Bess Ben designs from the 1920s tended to be rather traditional and conservative, like this leather beaded example. It wasn't until the 1940s that Greenfield acquired a reputation for these flamboyant designs made of unconventional materials. And you can see some examples on the table. So where were Chicago women wearing all of this finery that they might buy at Saks and Blum's and Jock's and Martha Weathered? They might be going to the opera. In 1922, the Chicago Civic Opera Company was formed with utilities company owner Samuel Insull as its president and opera singer Mary Garden as its musical director. Up until the 1928 season, the Civic Opera performed at the Auditorium Theater, which has great acoustics, but not so much backstage space, which limited the types of productions that the company could undertake. In 1929, the Civic Opera got a new home, a theater in the Civic Opera building on North Wacker Drive. Revenue from the office space here, from the rental of the office space, was intended to subsidize the opera company. The building was designed by Graham Anderson, Probst, and White, the architects of the Wrigley Building, and the style combined the setbacks typical of Art Deco with stylized French Renaissance decoration. This view of the building from the southwest shows the river facade, and it has a stepped-back configuration resembling a high-backed armchair. It was called Insull's Throne. The theater opened on November 4th, 1929, just 6 days after the stock market crash. But that didn't keep the crowds away. As you can see from this opening night photo, they pulled up in front of that columned loggia, entered this elegant lobby with spectacular light fixtures decorated with stylized theatrical masks, and then filed into the auditorium, which has a fire curtain painted by Jules Guerin, who illustrated the plan of Chicago. The opening night performance was Aida, starring Rosa Raissa, whom you see on the right. Opera is not to everyone's taste, and Chicago of the 1920s offered plenty of other options for entertainment, like the movies. Several splendid movie palaces were constructed in Chicago in the 1920s, like the Chicago Theater on North State Street. The Chicago Theater was one of the Balaban and Katz theaters, one of that chain, and it was designed by the noted theater designers Rapp and Rapp in a French Baroque revival style. The facade is modeled after the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and it was billed as the wonder theater of the world. The first movie shown here was The Sign on the Door, starring Norma Talmadge. And in between screenings, there were stage shows featuring a 50-piece orchestra. And, speaking of organs, Jessie Crawford was on the Wurlitzer organ. Another Balaban and Katz theater in the Loop was the Oriental Theater on Randolph Street. It was also designed by Rapp and Rapp. The interior is an East Indian fantasy. The opening day program featured the movie Tramp, 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 starring Joan Crawford and Henry Langdon, and 2 musical reviews, Insultin' the Sultan and Harum Scarum. The ushers here wore turbans and Arabian Nights-inspired costumes. And for North Side audiences, there was the Uptown Theater on North Broadway, Also owned by Balaban and Katz, and also designed by Rapp and Rapp, this time in a Spanish Baroque revival style. This is the palatial lobby. Hopefully, maybe a few years from now, we'll be able to see this again. And this is the auditorium, which had a seating capacity of over 4,000. It was promoted as an acre of seats in a magic city. The stage shows here follow the theme of the movies that were being shown. Chicagoans have always been big sports fans. And in the 1920s, two major new venues for sporting events were constructed. One of these was Grant Park Stadium, which opened in 1924. The following year, it was renamed Soldier Field. It's a neoclassical design with these Doric colonnades to the east and west. The Chicago Bears did not begin playing here until the 1970s, but there were plenty of other events being held at Soldier Field during the 1920s. It opened with a police athletic meet on October 9th, 1924, which was the 53rd anniversary of, anybody know? The Chicago Fire. The first football game was played that November. Northwestern played Notre Dame, and Notre Dame won. In 1926, the Army-Navy game was held in Soldier Field, and it ended in a tie. And in 1927, Soldier Field hosted a boxing match between Gene Tunney and Jack Dempsey that became known as the Long Count Fight. A year earlier, Tunney had defeated Dempsey to become the world's heavyweight champion. In this rematch, Dempsey was hoping to take the title from him. During the match, Dempsey knocked Tunney down, but he refused to immediately retreat to a neutral corner so that the count could begin. As a result, Tunney had more time to recover. In the later rounds, he made a comeback, and he was declared the winner, and he retained his title. Other events that were held at Soldier Field in the 1920s included bicycle races and skating meets. In 1929, a new facility for indoor sporting events opened in Chicago, the Chicago Stadium on Madison Street. The Chicago Stadium was developed by Patty Harmon, who was a local sports promoter who wanted to bring professional hockey to Chicago. But he was a little bit late because someone else had already arranged to bring a National League hockey franchise to the city. So Harmon decided that if he couldn't own the team, he would own the building that they played in, and he had the Chicago Stadium constructed. The stadium had unobstructed views, and it had twice the number of seats as Madison Square Garden in New York. The building was decorated with a frieze depicting athletes that wrapped, let's see if I get the cursor to work here, wrapped around, getting ahead of myself here. It wrapped around the upper portion of the building. When the stadium was demolished in the mid-1990s, the frieze was salvaged. And today it's on the exterior walls of the gymnasium at St. Ignatius College Prep on Roosevelt Road. So here's a portion of the frieze. And here's some details of the figures. It's a very Art Deco design. In the 1920s, Chicago had a very vibrant music scene. And several of the musicians who were performing in Chicago at that time went on to national and even international acclaim. One of the city's own was Benny Goodman. He grew up in Lawndale, and at the age of 10, he began taking clarinet lessons from a member of the Chicago Symphony at a local synagogue. By the following year, he was playing with the Hull House Boys Club Band, and at the age of 16, he joined the Ben Pollock Orchestra, which was a popular dance band in Chicago. Here's the orchestra in this photograph. The leader, Ben Pollock, is at the center. Oh, sorry, I won't use the cursor. Over on the far left is Glenn Miller, who also played with the band, and next to him is Benny Goodman. When the band left Chicago in the late 1920s, Goodman went with them. By 1929, he was working as a studio musician in New York, and in the 1930s, he would form his own group. Louis Armstrong was a transplant to Chicago. He was from New Orleans. In 1922, his friend Joe Oliver invited him to come to Chicago and play second cornet for King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, which you see here. Oliver is the second from the right, the head of the band, and Louis Armstrong is next to him. And the woman seated at the piano is Lil Hardin, who would become Armstrong's wife. The group played at Southside clubs located in the area of the Stroll, which was the name given to South State Street between approximately 27th and 39th Street. They played in clubs like Lincoln Gardens on East 31st Street and the Sunset Cafe on East 35th. In the forgot to mention that Armstrong made his first studio recording with Oliver's band. Some of the numbers that were featured were Alligator Hop and Snake Rag and Sugarfoot Stomp. In the mid-1920s, Armstrong went to New York, and he spent a year playing with the band there. When he came back to Chicago, he substituted the trumpet for the cornet. The trumpet differed slightly in its shape and its sound from the cornet. He played with the Dreamland Syncopators, which was a group that was started by his wife and with other bands at venues like the Savoy Ballroom, located at 47th Street and South Parkway, which is now Martin Luther King Drive, in an area of Chicago that in the late 1920s replaced the Stroll as the place to go hear jazz in the city. In addition to hearing some hot jazz at these Southside clubs, you might also be able to enjoy an alcoholic beverage, despite the fact that the 20s was the Prohibition era. Some of these clubs served illegal alcohol or looked the other way when their patrons brought in their own flasks. It was not very hard to find a drink in Chicago during Prohibition because there were more than 10,000 speakeasies here. Places like the Green Door on Orleans Street, located in a wooden frame building that dates back to the 1870s, to just after the Chicago fire. The Green Door was the code for a speakeasy. It was originally a grocery store, and then it became a restaurant. It was called the Huron Orleans, and then it became a speakeasy. And it's still there today, and on the lower level, there's a bar behind a door that's disguised as a bookcase. On the north side, there was the Green Mill, which is still there today as well. It opened in the early 1900s as Pop Morse's Roadhouse. And then for a while, it was the Green Mill Gardens. The name was inspired by the Moulin Rouge, the Red Mill in Paris. The gardens were removed when the Uptown Theater was constructed on the same block. The Green Mill became a speakeasy, and one of the members of Al Capone's outfit was a part owner. This was one of Capone's haunts. He had a favorite booth here, which is still there today, and it offered clear views of both entrances. And there was also a tunnel underneath the bar that was used to smuggle alcohol, and Capone could also use it as an escape route in case the authorities showed up. Well, the mention of Al Capone brings us to a phase of Chicago history that can't be ignored when you're talking about the city in the 1920s, much as we sometimes might want to. But the 1920s brings us to Chicago's gangster past. That was the time that saw the rise of Alphonse Gabriel Capone, Al Capone or Scarface or Public Enemy #1. Al Capone was from New York. He came to Chicago in the early 20s when he was in his early 20s, and he became the right-hand man to mob boss Johnny Torrio. In the mid-1920s, when Torrio was seriously injured in an assassination attempt, he decided it might be time to retire, and Al Capone was there to take his place. Capone became involved in just about every type of illegal activity that there was in Chicago. Speakeasies, bootlegging, prostitution, gambling. He was able to evade prosecution largely through his relationship with Big Bill Thompson, who was, again, the mayor. We saw him in the earlier photo. He was opening the Michigan Avenue Bridge. After his term expired in 1923, he took a 4-year hiatus. But then he was reelected in 1927, in part through the efforts of Al Capone. So he really owed Capone. Capone, from 1928 until the early 30s, operated out of his headquarters in the Lexington Hotel in the 2100 block of South Michigan Avenue, just a few blocks from here. Chicago's gang rivalry ended with well, not necessarily ended, but it reached a bloody climax on February 14, 1929, with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On that day, 7 members of the gang headed by the Irish gangster George Moran, who was known as Bugs Moran, were killed in a garage in the 2200 block of North State Street, where Moran had his bootlegging operation. And this is a photo of the garage after it became a storage facility. The murderers had posed as policemen, and they claimed that they were there to arrest the gang members. But instead, they lined them up against a wall and shot them. And this is the headline that appeared in the Chicago Daily News. Online, you can also find photos of the bodies of the victims, but I decided that I would spare you that tonight. Moran was not in the garage at the time, so he escaped execution. Al Capone was at his home, in Miami on Palm Island. And I was just in Miami about 2 weeks ago, and I sailed past Al Capone's former home. And you can't see too much of the original house because of all the greenery, but this is the guard house, so this is where his bodyguards were stationed. So Capone was not in Chicago, but it was widely speculated that he had ordered the hit, although nothing was ever proven and no one was ever convicted. But after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, federal authorities increased their surveillance of Capone, and in the early 1930s, he would be jailed for tax evasion. I didn't want to leave you tonight with images of Chicago's mob violence, so I looked for a sweeter topic to end on. In 1920, H. Teller Archibald opened his first Fannie Mae candy store here in Chicago. It was located in the Loop. It was on South LaSalle Street. Who was Fannie Mae? No one seems to know, but it is certainly a very beloved name in Chicago. It has been for almost 100 years now, and she's still with us today. And I understand that there is some Fannie Mae candy here tonight. So enjoy the Fannie Mae candy, the other refreshments. I think that Linda has some words to say to you before we adjourn to the fellowship hall, but thank you again for coming tonight.
Thank you, Kathleen. Fascinating history. Kathleen will be at the reception and happy to answer your questions there. Before we adjourn to the reception and fellowship hall, I have a few more acknowledgments that I'd like to make. Mary, would you come up? Mary Baccaro is a Friends board member and has planned tonight's wonderful program, and I wanted to present her with these flowers. Thank you, Mary. She's actually planned all 7 of our celebrations of Chicago history, and it's just such a joy to let her run these things and know that it will be so beautifully organized. Mary's been assisted by a planning committee. When I call your name, please stand. The planning committee consists of Karen Fontaine, Bill Crawford, Karen Oliver, Heather Haberacker, Ann Bellatier, and Sharon Sylvester. Thank you all very much. Thank you also to our many, many docents who are here tonight providing tours. They are a wonderful group of docents with an incredible depth of knowledge about this beautiful building. And if you didn't get a tour earlier before the program, there will be docents here that can provide a tour to you, for you, after the program, but make sure you get to the reception as well. I also want to say thanks to Heather Kendall, standing over here. She's our administrative manager, and she has handled so many, many details of this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge some of our donors of the food we're going to be eating: Trader Joe's, Motor Row Brewing, and Fannie Mae Candy, as Kathleen said. Michael Shawgo, who is sitting up here, our organist. He's the music director here at Second Presbyterian Church, and he selected the wonderful, fun music that we're hearing tonight. And then we also have a treat for you at the reception. Stephen Bowman Jr. and Joseph Power, 2 young jazz musicians, will be providing jazz for us during the reception. I also want to make one final important notice. Please take note. Anyone who parked in the McKinley lot on Wabash at 1819 Wabash, please note that that will be closed at 8:30. If you don't have your car out before 8:30, the gates will be locked and you won't be able to get your car. You should be able to be out of here by then. And now, please join me after Michael is going to play one more song, a lot of fun, hee hee ha ha, or something like that. And as he's playing, you may exit and join us for a wonderful reception in Fellowship Hall. Thank you for joining us tonight, and enjoy the reception.